A deep dive in the morning, another one in the afternoon, it still works.
More than 2 dives in 24 hours, you're sure you'll end up in the therapeutic chamber.
4 or 5 dives a day, for several days. What's the problem?
To fully understand the challenges related to repetitive dives, we will have to once again dive into history. Listing the existing knowledge should help us not only better understand the issues, but also explain them simply and easily. During his research, Scott Haldane was not particularly focused on repetitive exposure. He knew that pearl and sponge divers experience a significantly higher number of caissons disease after short and repeated dives. He reported the experience of public works contractors specialized in bridge construction or tunnel drilling. On the job sites, workers always worked under pressure. Their workday was typically interrupted by 2 breaks, during which they would return to atmospheric pressure for a well-deserved meal. Foremen noted a much higher number of accidents after the final decompression. Haldane was therefore well aware of the particular dangers of these repeated dives. He explained quite simply that between 2 close exposure, parts of the body that desaturate slowly didn't have enough time to eliminate all the nitrogen they had accumulated. He used an exponential law often employed in mathematics and physics to calculate the saturation and desaturation of human tissues during immersions. This law is, of course, also valid for the desaturation of those same tissues during the surface interval. Calculating the residual nitrogen during the surface interval between 2 dives was well within Haldane's capabilities. However, to ensure safe decompression, he recommended adding the times of the different exposure and using the greatest depth to calculate the decompression for the next dive. This meant treating both dives as one and ignoring the elimination of the dissolved nitrogen during the surface interval. Why on earth did Haldane think it was advisable to suggest such a restrictive procedure? Perhaps because it was not part of the objectives set by the British Admiralty, and he preferred to focus his work on the main subject. Or perhaps because, at a time when all calculation had to be done and verified manually, Haldane could hardly have proposed anything better. The leading compartment is used to calculate the decompression of a dive. But let's remember that the nitrogen pressure in all compartments must be calculated and compared to the critical supersaturation ratio, which Haldane set at 2:1, before determining which compartment is leading. Let's also recall that only this leading compartment allows for calculating the needed decompression depth and time for the nitrogen it contains to return below the maximum pressure it can handle before moving on to the next stop or the surface. We know that a compartment, whatever it may be, is almost back to its initial state after 6 periods. The first compartment selected by Haldane can therefore be considered fully desaturated after a 30-minute surface interval. For the 10-minute compartment, one must wait 1 hour. Let's imagine that after 1 hour spent on the surface, after a first dive, a diver goes on a second dive. Let's assume that for this second dive, the decompression is led by the 10-minute period compartment, for example, 30 minutes at 30 meters, 18 minutes at 40 meters, 12 minutes at 50 meters, or 10 minutes at 60 meters. At the start of this second dive, the 10-minute period compartment is considered completely desaturated, as one unfortunate diver has spent 6 periods on the surface. During the ascent, it is this 10-minute period compartment that will control the decompression. The decompression time for the second dive will therefore be exactly the same as for the first, since the leading compartment had the time to fully desaturate during the surface interval. It's as if the first dive never existed. Its behavior is reproducible with the same interval, the same time, and the same depth for a third dive, a fourth, and even a 10th, until a longer compartment becomes sufficiently saturated to become the one leading. In theory, this behavior is perfectly compliant, but we now know that many phenomena come into play during repetitive dives. At the beginning of the 20th century, these concepts were completely unknown. Experiments on goats showed that residual nitrogen pressure alone was not sufficient to ensure safety for second exposure. Haldane chose great caution. To prioritize safety, the method he proposes takes into account neither the decompression performed at the end of the first dive, nor the desaturation occurring during the stay at the surface between the two immersions. These rules are quickly deemed excessive. The major international naval forces seek a replacement procedure more compatible with their operational needs, but 2 world wars will force them to focus their efforts. It will take 4 decades before work can resume.